They say every great love story begins with a spark, a glance across the room, a spontaneous kiss in the rain, or maybe the gentle warmth of a hand reached out during a storm. But this story, it didn't begin with fire. It began with silence, cold, strategic, and meticulously signed at the bottom of a legal document. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey. Isabella Reed wasn't the type to believe in fairy tales. She was a scientist, the daughter of a neurologist, someone who trusted in logic data and controlled variables. But life in its chaotic brilliance rarely adheres to scientific method. Her father's independent research institute, once a beacon of groundbreaking neural studies, was days away from closing its doors. Grants had dried up, support had vanished, and years of legacy were on the brink of being erased. And then there was the proposal, not with roses or rings, but with clauses and expectations. Julian Blackwood wasn't searching for romance either. He had lost his sister Amelia in a tragic accident that left him hollowed out, emotionally unavailable, and weighed down by legacy. The Blackwood family was old money, the kind of family that measured value in heritage and heirs not in happiness. As the only remaining child, Julian was tasked with continuing a name older than the very buildings they owned. And with that came one condition: produce an heir, and soon. So when two strangers sat down not at a candlelit dinner, but across a mahogany table in a law office, the conversation was dry and direct. I need funding for my lab. I need a child within a year. That was it. No pretense, no illusions. Just a merger of needs, like two corporations sealing a deal. The ink dried before either of them realized the magnitude of the pact they had entered. You might think that a love built on such calculated terms is doomed, and perhaps you'd be right, but not in the way you'd expect. Because sometimes the most fragile things in life don't die from a lack of feeling. They die from feeling too much too late. The early days of their marriage were sterile. The Blackwood estate in Kensington, with its marble floors and antique chandeliers, could have passed for a museum. Julian had his wing filled with books, whiskey, and quiet. Isabella had hers, a converted basement where beakers and brain scans kept her company. They were like ghosts passing through a house they both technically owned, but emotionally never inhabited. What's fascinating about arranged relationships, be they culturally driven or, as in this case, circumstantially transactional, is how they challenge our ideas of intimacy. Can respect grow where love never existed? Can duty transform into devotion? In this story, we see glimmers, little things: a breakfast tray with no name attached, a glance held 1 second too long across a cold dining room, silent signals that maybe, just maybe, the fortress was cracking. Then came the collapse, quite literally. Isabella, consumed by her work, skipped meals, forgot to rest, and one day passed out in her lab. Julian, ever the statue, found her. And for the first time since their vows, he touched her. He carried her to bed, sat beside her, and whispered not commands but concern. It wasn't poetic, but it was real. And sometimes reality is more powerful than poetry. Here's where this story turns. And not just narratively, but emotionally. Because real love, the kind that grips you unexpectedly, doesn't always enter through the front door. It seeps in through care, shared pain, and quiet presence. Julian begins to change. His notes become regular. His interest in her research becomes more than polite. One night, as frost gathered outside, he sat beside her in silence, not as a CEO, not as a husband, but as a human. No words were needed. Their shared stillness said it all. And then the twist of fate, a forgotten allergy, a slice of cake, and Julian on the brink of death. Isabella, trained in medicine, reacted with speed and precision. She saved his life. And in doing so, she unearthed something buried deep within both of them: vulnerability. From that night onward, their dynamics shifted. They began to talk, really talk, about Amelia, the sister Julian couldn't save, about a young boy Isabella once lost in surgery, the reason she chose her field. They discovered their pain mirrored each other's, that they weren't cold, just scared, not unfeeling, just armored. But here's where reality pulls the rug out, because life and love are never linear. Isabella discovers a file, a sealed folder in Julian's office that links their fates in a way she never saw coming. Her father, once revered, had been accused of unethical practices by Julian's own family. The lawsuit destroyed everything. Her lab was saved not out of love, but as restitution. Suddenly, everything, the proposal, the funding, even the timing, looked less like fate and more like a vendetta cloaked in a wedding dress. And this is where Isabella makes the hardest decision of all: not to fight, not to confront, but to walk away. She flees, pregnant, alone, but not broken. And this perhaps is the boldest thing any woman can do, to leave before she's left. She writes Julian a letter. "You wanted heirs. I've given you two. The contract is fulfilled. No drama, no confrontation, just closure, or at least the version she could afford to give." Now let's pause for a moment and bring this out of fiction and into reality. There are countless stories like this in our world. Though less dramatic, the emotional core remains the same. Women who enter relationships not out of affection but necessity. Men raised to see family as business, not connection. And in between, the quiet heartbreaks that no one writes books about. People who stayed for the children. People who left to protect their sanity. People who looked at love not as salvation, but as collateral damage. A friend of mine, an ER nurse, once told me how she divorced her husband after 10 years of functional coldness. They never fought, never yelled, never cheated, but they also never touched, never shared, never healed. One day, while reading to their daughter, she realized she hadn't felt love, not in years, maybe not ever. So she packed her bags and left. "You don't have to be abused to be unhappy," she told me. "Sometimes it's the absence of everything that kills you." That's the power of this story, not in its twists, but in its truth. Isabella doesn't leave out of revenge. She leaves to reclaim herself. She knows her children deserve a home built on more than contracts and courtesy. Julian, meanwhile, undergoes a transformation too. And it's not dramatic. He doesn't chase her down with flowers or show up in the rain. He retreats, reflects, and builds something new, not for legacy, but for healing. He names a foundation after his sister in the son he never met. He funds brain trauma research, this time led by women, by people like Isabella. Because real redemption doesn't scream. It shows up quietly, consistently, when no one's watching. Have you ever had a moment where pretending led to something unexpectedly real? Please comment below and like this video if you believe the best love stories start with honesty. Subscribe our channel now for more powerful story-based videos every day. Months pass like whispers through an abandoned hallway. The Grand Blackwood estate, once buzzing with silent obligations and unspoken expectations, now stood still. Julian no longer hosted board meetings in its drawing rooms or posed for Forbes editorials on its stone terrace. He wasn't chasing numbers anymore. He was chasing something far more elusive: meaning. He didn't send investigators. He didn't leverage his power to track her down. He respected her silence, not because he wanted to, but because for the first time he understood that silence was a message of boundary. In Cornwall, far from the noise of legacy, Isabella found peace and simplicity. She rented a modest cottage by the sea, worked at a small health clinic under a different name, and raised her twin boys with the rhythm of the tides. Leo and Elias, their names were hers to choose their future, hers to shape. There were no marble staircases, no candlelit ballrooms, just sandy feet, sleepy smiles, and the scent of salt and baby shampoo on her skin. Every night she'd tuck them into bed and whisper a story not just to them, but to herself. A reminder that love, real love, could begin with presence, not perfection. But memory has a way of creeping in, even in paradise. Sometimes as the sun dipped low over the waves, she'd picture Julian's eyes across a dinner table, softened and uncertain. She'd hear his voice raw and real the night he almost died. She'd remember the first time he didn't walk away. And then she'd remember the folder, the lawsuit, the betrayal written in legal ink long before she ever entered the picture. A pain that predated even their cold wedding vows. Some people say love is stronger than history, but that's not always true. Love can be born in history's ashes, yes, but only if you clear the ruins first. Back in London, Julian tried to do just that. He launched the Amelia and Leo Fund, named for the sister he lost and the child he never got to hold. Its mission: to fund neurological rehabilitation programs in underserved regions, focusing on ethical science and compassion-led research. The Catch Women-led teams would be prioritized. A subtle nod, maybe even a quiet apology. Julian stepped out of the spotlight. No press releases, no gala dinners. Just work, just listening. He read every proposal Isabella had ever submitted to grant agencies, highlighted them, annotated them. For the first time, he didn't dismiss her brilliance as a footnote to his narrative. And then something changed. One afternoon during a routine review of the Foundation's outreach programs, a name popped up. Not a full name, just Dr. Isabel R., filed under a project titled Child Brain Recovery Initiative, Cornwall Branch. Julian froze. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't a declaration, but it was enough. He didn't call, didn't email. He simply drove. He didn't arrive in a black car with tinted windows. He didn't bring bodyguards or announce himself to the clinic's director. He went to the playground, and there among the sea breeze and rusted swings, he saw them. Two boys, around a year old, light brown hair, storm gray eyes. He watched as one tripped and the other helped him up laughing, unaware of the man watching from a distance with a chest full of unspoken words. Julian didn't move closer. He didn't speak. He just stood still, eyes wet, breath uneven. Later that night, he sent an email not to Isabella, but to the planning committee of a global medical ethics conference. He nominated a speaker, Dr. Isabel R., his proposal a keynote titled Science, Love, and the Cost of Arranged Marriages, When Silence Becomes the Price. He had nothing left to prove, only the truth to tell. Isabella nearly declined the invitation. She read the title 3 times before she could breathe again, but something within her stirred not anger, not even closure, just a readiness to be heard. On the day of the conference, she stepped onto the stage in a white suit, hair-pinned back voice, soft but razor sharp. Julian sat in the last row. No spotlight, no suit, just a man who had lost something sacred and knew it. The only reason I am alive to speak today, she said, is because I chose to leave. Not out of hate, out of survival. I chose life, for myself, for 2 children who deserve love unburdened by legacy. I don't ask for agreement. I only ask to be heard. She didn't speak like a victim. She spoke like a survivor, a woman who had carried pain but refused to let it shape her children's future. When applause faded, Julian was asked to speak. No one expected him to accept, but he did. His voice didn't tremble, but it wasn't polished either. It was raw, stripped bare. I once asked a woman to marry me, he said, without offering her love. I gave her terms, set rules, called it safety. But I was building a cage not just for her, but for myself. She didn't leave to punish me. She left because she was the only one brave enough to live honestly. He looked at her not with a plea, not with regret, but with recognition. He saw her now truly, and maybe for the first time. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Blackwood Foundation's office. No signature, no promises, just one line. If you truly want to meet them, not to demand, but to be present, come to the South Shore Cliffs at 5 p.m. this Sunday. The sea was calm that evening. The boys were running ahead, their laughter carried by the wind. Isabella stood alone waiting. Julian arrived not late, not rushed. He walked like a man who knew he couldn't fix the past but could still show up for the present. They don't need a legacy, she said quietly. They need presence, not from a powerful man, from a father. I don't know how to be one, he replied, but I want to learn, if you'll let me. She didn't smile, but she nodded. They're home now, she said. You can start with bedtime stories. No dramatic music, no embrace. Just two people finally standing on the same side of truth. This story at its core is not about betrayal or redemption. It's about evolution, about the courage to step out of inherited roles and into humanity, about rewriting narratives written by power and pain, and daring to author a new one with empathy and hope. And that night when Julian knelt beside their sons reading a picture book with awkward inflection and a voice unused to nursery rhymes, Isabella watched from the hallway. She didn't cry. She breathed. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a declaration. It was a quiet decision, a choice to let someone walk beside you again, not because they deserved it, but because you deserve peace. Time didn't reset for them. It didn't grant them a clean slate or erase the heartbreak written in the spaces between their first year together. But it softened them. It gave them room to breathe, to rebuild, to remember what they wanted beyond obligation. In the months that followed, Julian didn't try to win back Isabella. There were no grand gestures, no public apologies aired on national news. Instead, he did something far more radical. He showed up. Every Sunday, every night he was invited. He learned how to cradle a bottle without tipping it. He listened to their bedtime babble like it was sacred scripture. He stopped wearing cufflinks and started carrying Band-Aids in his pocket. For scraped knees, for first heartbreaks, for the quiet injuries no one talks about. And Isabella, she didn't fall back into his arms. She didn't melt. She observed, carefully, patiently. Because love, true love, isn't about return. It's about safety. Trust rebuilt brick by brick, not handed out like candy. She watched how he sat through tantrums without raising his voice. How he looked at their sons like they were miracles, not proof of contract fulfillment. How he stopped talking about legacy altogether and started talking about kindergarten sea creatures and bedtime snacks. There was one evening, just after a storm, when the power flickered out in the cottage. The boys were restless, afraid of the dark. Isabella reached for a flashlight, but Julian beat her to it. He knelt beside them, telling a made-up story about a brave raccoon and a clumsy owl. The boys giggled, clung to him slowly, forgetting their fear. When they finally fell asleep, Isabella sat beside him on the couch. No words, just silence. But this time the silence didn't hurt. It comforted. He looked at her then, not to seek forgiveness, but to say thank you silently through eyes that had finally learned to speak the language of presence. And you know what's remarkable? This wasn't a story that needed a fairy tale ending. It didn't need a kiss in the rain or a surprise wedding renewal. What it needed and what it gave was something most stories forget: space for complexity. Because life is messy. Sometimes love grows from places it shouldn't. Sometimes it takes root in trauma. But that doesn't mean it can't evolve into something beautiful. Not perfect, but real. And that right there is what we need to talk about. This story resonates not because it's unique, but because it's so heartbreakingly familiar to so many people. People who marry for the wrong reasons. People who stay out of fear or leave out of courage. People who look back years later and think, could we have done it differently if we had just been honest sooner? I know a woman named Lila, a real estate agent in her 30s, who told me once that she married her first husband because he was stable, kind, and loved her more than she loved herself. It felt practical, she said, like locking in a good mortgage rate. But 5 years in, with no fights and no passion, she left. He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't my person, and I wasn't his either. We were both pretending. On the flip side, I once interviewed a couple married 42 years who had also started with an arranged setup. The wife, Lena, told me we weren't in love when we married, but we decided every morning to respect each other. Then one day after 12 years, he brought me tea in bed and I realized, this man is my home now. Love isn't always lightning. Sometimes it's embers. Sometimes it starts with a contract, but if you're lucky, it evolves into a connection. But and this is crucial for that evolution to happen, both people need to grow, to admit their failures, to rewrite their patterns, to stop treating love like a checklist or an inheritance. Julian Blackwood learned that lesson. Late, yes, but deeply. He had everything: wealth, power, legacy, but none of that taught him how to hold a newborn, or how to apologize without excuses, or how to listen without fixing. It was Isabella who taught him that, not through lectures but through absence, through walking away and forcing him to meet himself in the quiet that followed. And here's the bigger takeaway: sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a relationship, or even in your career, your family, your life, is leave. Not to destroy, but to disrupt. Not to punish, but to protect the sacred things inside you that are quietly dying from neglect. When Isabella walked out of that estate, she didn't just save herself. She saved the future of her children. She saved the memory of who she used to be before the silence and obligations buried her. And she gave Julian the one thing he never realized: he needed the opportunity to be human again. In the final scene, if we can call it that, they aren't standing at an altar. They aren't surrounded by roses. They're in a small living room, their son's asleep, the dishwasher humming softly, and a single light on. Julian is reading a story aloud. Isabella is making tea. And for the first time, there's no mask, no contract, no performance. There is only presence. And isn't that what we're all really searching for? Not perfection, not fireworks, just someone willing to meet us where we are, to sit beside us in our silence, to laugh at the chaos of parenting, to tell us with or without words, I'm not leaving this time. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt stuck in a relationship that looked perfect on paper but felt empty in your soul, let this be your reminder. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to walk away. And you are allowed to return too if the soil has changed and the person on the other side has done the work. but never confuse someone's regret with their readiness. Julian was only ready once he stopped trying to fix Isabella and started trying to understand her. Once he stopped leading with pride and started walking with humility. In the end, this isn't a love story. It's a human story about wounds that run deep, about betrayals that echo, about babies born in the middle of a storm, and about what it means to be brave enough not to fall in love, but to stay grow and forgive in love. So ask yourself, where have I built walls instead of bridges? Who have I turned into a contract when they deserve to be a companion? And most importantly, if given the chance to start again, not from zero, but from truth, would I be willing to show up? Because healing doesn't require a grand ending. Sometimes healing just starts with a voice that says, "Good night, boys." And this time it's not a demand. It's a promise. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, made you think, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey.